Welcome, everybody. I'm Farah Mendlesohn. I'm a science fiction critic. Oh, stop. Welcome, everybody. I'm Farah Mendlesohn. I'm a science fiction critic and I'm part of the Edmonton bid team, and I'm in the UK tonight. And with me is Candas Jane Dorsey, who is one of Edmonton's best known writers and who I've known since 1995 when we met at the British Worldcon. Candas, I believe you are Edmonton born and bred.
I am that. And actually, I'm going to give a little acknowledgement of that because Edmonton is tradition. Its traditional name was the Miskouche Waskahegan and is on Treaty 6 land, land of the indigenous peoples, Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Blackfoot, Dene, part of Métis Nation number 4. And my own actual house is on the traditional lands of the Papas Chase Cree Nation. And so I want to acknowledge that our history in this place goes way before the settlement that was part of my history. I'm a fourth generation settler on this Treaty 6 land. So that's my acknowledgement of where I come from, has a very long history. My history in this place, of course, is lifelong. I was born in a hospital about 6 blocks that way. And somehow I've always returned to this place. And in part because I have a really strong connection to the land and the landscape. And in part because I have a really strong belief in the community here. And that community that I have worked for many years is a very diverse and active writing community. And I think that there's a connection between being far from some of the sort of canonical centers of culture that makes for a very rich and vibrant place to be. Edmonton is known as the city of festivals because we have the depending on the year, either the third or second largest Fringe theater festival in the world. The other, of course, Edinburgh being the top and Melbourne being the second, and we contest with Melbourne over the years for that second place spot. We have arts festivals, jazz festival, other kind of music festivals, literary festivals, and so anyone who's coming here for the Worldcon should have a look at the surrounding cultural calendar and maybe plan to stay. We're also really close to some beautiful natural resources. The mountains, of course, are very popular with anyone who comes here. So we live in a very beautiful and culturally rich place. We also live in a very odd place politically at the moment, but we try to think of that as just ephemeral, and it too will pass. So speaking as an Edmontonian to newcomers, I want to say this bid gives us an opportunity to really showcase Edmonton's, especially speculative fiction uh, uh, roots to the world. And those roots also go right back to the original indigenous peoples and the kind of storytelling. But in the more modern time, we are the source of On Spec magazine. We have a number of really fine writers coming out of Edmonton. If I can put myself in that list, I would also add Premier Mohammed, um, Doug Barber, the well-known critic and writer about science fiction and editor, comes from here, and poet, of course. So basically, it's been a place that has, for a long time, really grown and incubated uh, uh, speculative writers and fantasists and dreamers. And I think this bid that we're advertising for is an opportunity for people to come and see us on our home turf.
Well, I can't wait, although I have been to Edmonton, which I loved. Tell me a bit about how you got into science fiction, Candace. How did you started reading? How did you start writing?
Well, I started reading it when I was a kid. My dad was a big lover of science fiction, and we used to go to the library every Saturday. And we went to the store across the street that had fresh baked bread, and we bring our fresh books and our fresh baked bread home and slice the hot bread and put butter and brown sugar on it and sit reading these books. And Father was a great follower of those Yellowback Golan's science fiction books. So I saw a lot of those. There were a lot of them in the library, and he had his favorite people. And one of the great joys I had the very first time I went to international conference on the fantastic and the arts in Florida, Brian Aldiss was a permanent guest, and I actually went back up to my room and called my dad and said, "Daddy-o, guess what? Guess who's here? Guess who I just sat and had drinks with at the hotel? Brian Aldiss, the guy you were reading all the time."
It's
So
20 hours.
so I read so many things when I was sort of too young to assign that genre to them. I mean, one of the deals about my family is we're all big readers. So we'd come from the library with the stack of books. It was like, put the big books on the bottom and then you double stack the others, and the whole thing was about this high. And everyone read everyone's books during the week. And then we went back and got some more. So in a week, I might have books on calligraphy, World War II history, science fiction, more modern kind of novels. My mother's favorite was a woman named Jane Duncan, who came from Scotland. And of course, all the books that I would pick out. And so it was just a grand sort of cornucopia of words. And we didn't really distinguish them by genre so much as just by who liked them and whether we liked that individual book. So that was reading. And then as I started writing basically in a literary tradition. Doug Barber was actually one of my university profs in poetry, Rudy Wiebe in prose and so on. And I started writing things. And it was only later when and those things got published in literary magazines mostly, but only later when I started to pull together a manuscript of stories. And I sent it to Jerry Truscott, who was then the series editor of what later became Tesseract Books. And they were pressed Pork-Peak in Victoria at that point. And he said, "Well, you only have about 90 pages of speculative fiction. Can you write some more?" And my brain kind of exploded. It was like, but that's what I write. All those things are what I write. How come those ones are that and those ones are that? So then I had to kind of learn why genre fiction, basically, what that was about. So that was in the 1980s, I guess. And I've been kind of doing the same thing ever since, which is writing what I write and kind of fitting it into the different kind of genre boundaries or pushing the envelope a little bit. And that's kind of how I got started. And
I know you've written a couple of really fun crime novels fairly recently.
Yeah,
they're right out there at the moment.
And that's if I say I had fun writing those novels, people will think that the novels themselves have no weight. But I did have fun, and it was partly because I wrote them differently, like just in method differently, and also because I got to a point in my writing life where I honestly didn't care what a boundary was or what I was writing. I wanted to write something starting from the beginning, ending at the end. And I was working on a really tough book, and I was having a really tough life at that time. And my mom was in a nursing home, and just everything in my life was very sort of dark. And the last thing I wanted to do was keep writing this dark book. So I thought, well, let me just do a writer's version of fun, which is let me write something else and and see how it turns out. And as it happened, it turned out to be 3 books in a series, and they're still out there. I don't know if there's going to be a number 4. I'm kind of fiddling with something, but I'm also working on the edits for the very dark book, which is now going to be published next September from University of Calgary Press. So it's kind of 2 cycles completed themselves. The 3 books do kind of come to an end, but I titled them after nursery rhymes, and but they're not, nursery material, and they are set in my neighborhood, which is an inner city neighborhood, and I use them to kind of both have some fun and make some points about modern culture and homelessness and urban problems, urban issues, and so on. And so it's been kind of interesting, the contrast between that and fantasy and science fiction novels. In some ways, I consider them to be almost the same thing, and in other ways, of course, genre ways, they're very different. So
What's the
uh,
book?
I don't know. It's my curse again,
What is the dark book? What's its title?
It's called well, I'm not sure if it's going to be called At the Freak Show or just Freak Show, and it's kind of a slipstream magic realist uh, book. The premise is one half of a pair of conjoint twins who were separated very early in life, and one of them didn't make it in some realities. In other realities, they both made it. In other realities, the other one made it. But we concentrate mostly on the reality where this individual kind of made it through the surgery, and then their life happened, and so on. I I'm not sure I can say there's a plot. It's one of those plots that's basically someone's life, uh, with little curly cues and fancy bits around the edges.
Right. Going back a little bit, I think when I first met you, you were quite heavily involved with the Tesseract anthologies. And I remember those as a kind of a real breakthrough, my first real awareness of Canadian science fiction as a thing, as something that felt quite different from American science fiction. Could you talk about them a bit?
Absolutely, and I'll give you some secret history too, because Jerry Truscott, whom I mentioned as the series editor for what became Tesseract Books, but the series was named after the first anthology, not the other way around. I was talking to him about maybe a collection, and we got talking. And this was in the days when you either talked on the telephone or wrote letters to each other. But so we're talking on the phone, and he wanted to put together an anthology of Canadian speculative fiction. And he had tried to get um, Spider Robinson and Jeannie Robinson to edit it, but they were very busy. And I had been talking to Doug Barber, and he had talked to me about how Judith Merrill was living in Toronto, and I said to him, well, why don't you get? I said to Jerry, why don't you get Judy Merrill, who is like famous anthologist, et cetera, et cetera. And long story short, he did manage to get her to edit the first one, which is up there on the shelf somewhere. And I had a story. And so that kind of got me connected with Judy Merrill and her connections to the whole science fiction and fantasy community in the States and around the world. And it also started this series of anthologies. And after that, they came out about once every 2 years. The second one was edited by Phyllis Gottlieb, Canadian-born science fiction writer, and Doug Barber, who was in Edmonton, and a well-known sort of critic and reader of science fiction. And then as we move forward, the third one was actually edited by Jerry Truscott and me. And each time there would be two editors, usually geographically different, sometimes male and female, sometimes just different for other reasons. And Porky Peak sold Tesseract books to Books Collective, which was us, me, which was very odd because they had published my first book of short stories, Machine Sex and Other Stories, and now I owned it, which is, in those days, that was kind of like I bought my own publisher. It was kind of weird. And it was not very much of a self-publishing world in those days. And then after 9 years, we sold it to Edge in Calgary, but they keep bringing out the Tesseract anthologies. So there's been, they're not annual, but there's been an unbroken stream of them. And David Hartwell with Tor and Glenn Grant in Montreal sort of used those anthologies as a bit of a jumping off point for Tor to bring out two anthologies of Canadian science fiction called Northern Stars, and I think the other one was called Northern Suns or something. I'm looking up at the bookshelf to try and see, but in any case, David also kind of mined those anthologies for writers, for the names of writers that he could later publish. And Tor actually became a kind of a clearinghouse for a lot of Canadian writers who were then published in the States. So myself, Carl Schrader, I'm Elizabeth Vonnerberg, I can't even, Peter Watts is another one. I can't really remember. And at the same time, Tanya Huff and Julie Cherneda were working at Backup Books, and they became sort of known. They were also writing, and they became known through that. So, Rob Sawyer was in that little sort of Toronto group. And so gradually, these little groups of operators, the West Coast group, which had Michael Coney and Eileen Kernahan, the Toronto group, there were kind of two, and one was Judy Merrill and Phyllis Gottlieb and John Robert Colombo. And there was a sort of a maritime group that included Austin Clark and Leslie Choice and some others. So with these little sort of groups around Canada, and I'm only speaking of the English Canadian because, of course, there were also the Francophone writers who were clustered around Ottawa and clustered in Montreal and Chicoutimi, of all places, which is where Elizabeth Vonnerberg settled. And
Right.
I mean, if we want a big history lesson, La Vonnerberg used to be a pop star in France, but she loved winter. And so she wanted to move to Canada, to a place that had lots of winter. So she moved to Canada and went to Chicoutimi. And so all of these threads started to come together in the 80s and wove together into kind of a second scene. There had been a first scene with Judy Merrill, Phyllis Gottlieb, Hank Hargreaves, a few other people in sort of that generation. And John Robert Colombo had collected them and some other writers in his other Canada's anthologies. But then the Tesseract anthologies began to incubate a whole other generation that started to weave together, meet each other, and started to kind of create a Canadian voice, if you will. And the critic Robert Runte kind of put his finger on the things that made science fiction Canadian, which involved kind of the other, a point of view from the other, not always the main character, and some other kind of outsider things, the presence of a hostile frontier, the Arctic, etc. Kind of Margaret Atwood with ray guns, if you will, because she wrote her kind of critical theory about Canadian science fiction. But this was at the same time, like Robert wasn't jumping off hers. He was creating the same kind of thing at about the same time, but there was overlap in terms of how they saw this community. So so that kind of brings us by leaps and bounds to the present day. And what I'm seeing now is like I'm getting old, and so are all the people who were part of that 1980s weave. And some of us are old and like eminence grise, and others are old and not as well known, and others are old uh, and gone, right? Others are gone, and there's a new set of Canadian writers, and at least a couple of them that are very strong come from Alberta. Premi Mohammed is Edmonton born and
Yeah.
bred, and she's a powerhouse and an amazing award-winning writer. CJ Levine harkens at the moment from Red Deer, but there's another whole fabric of writers of their generation that are just really taking speculative fiction by storm. And I think that some of those may have been nurtured by some of the magazines that were started in the 80s, like On Spec and Carl Johansson's magazine, what's it called? In any case, but some of them aren't. Some of them actually come from a more international view of, they plugged into, say, horror as it was known in the States and Britain and so on. So they think of themselves and their roots as not primarily Canadian. They don't make a big deal of it. So there's your 5-minute history lesson, or maybe it was 10.
Or different kind of Canadian. And we're going to need to round up soon, but just a quick shout out to Premier Mohammed, who is on the Hugo ballot this year, which is fantastic, and who is also elsewhere on the programme for the bid party event on the 16th of August. So people will get a chance to hear her. We need to wrap up now. Is there a last comment you'd like to make about where you think science fiction in Canada is going, or science fiction in Edmonton?
Well, Edmonton's a weird place right now because I mentioned there's some Alberta, the province we're in, has some political strife, shall we say. And what seems to be happening is that those of us who wrote dystopian science fiction in the 1980s and 90s may be finding things a little too close for comfort in this area. But at the same time, there's also just this of wild culture, like in The Wild Hunt, like galumphing along outside of history are these people who are just incredibly creative. My feeling is that, I mean, part of the reason I think this bid is a wonderful thing is because so much important stuff happens outside the hegemony. So much important stuff happens not at places where we think of as the apex of a culture, but places where culture is lacking and has to be made. And so there's a creativity level here that is just astonishing. And I think people should come and visit us and find that out. And stick around a while on either side of the World Fund that will be in 2030.
Thank you, Candace. That was fantastic. I am going to stop the recording there.